Hey everyone, if you enjoy my park ranger horror stories, I've started uploading them on Spotify too. My YouTube channel got demonetized, so I'm putting a lot more focus into Spotify now. You'll find daily scary stories there with longer, darker, and more immersive horror content. If you want to support the channel, please go follow the Spotify page and leave a 5-star rating. It genuinely helps me keep making these stories. The Spotify link is in the description and pinned comment. Turn off the lights. Put on your headphones and I'll see you there. You want to know what 3 hours of your life looks like when they're completely gone from your memory? It doesn't look like anything. That's the thing about it. I'm Chris Haney. I've been a backcountry ranger in Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 8 years now. Before that, I grew up in Knoxville, spent my whole life around these mountains. I know trails that don't have names. I know which ridges get fog at what time of day. I know what a bear sounds like a quarter-mile away, and what a person sounds like when they're bleared, actually hurt, versus when they're just scared. I'm the guy other rangers call when someone needs to get carried out on a stretcher. I mention that because I need you to understand I'm not the kind of person who imagines things. What I'm about to tell you happened in October, about 2 years back. I still work for the park, but I transferred to the office side. I don't do backcountry anymore. They didn't make me transfer. I asked for it. But before I get to why, you need to understand what Bone Valley is. Great Smoky Mountains covers over 800 square miles, more than 900 miles of trail. And because of the park's size and the way the ridges run through it, there are these long, narrow valleys that almost nobody ever goes into. Bone Valley is one of them. It's a drainage system on the Tennessee side, hemmed in by steep ridges on both sides. You can only really get into it on one trail, and it climbs up and over from the Elkmont area. The trail itself is 6 miles round trip, and most of that is uphill on the way in. The valley itself is narrow, maybe 200 yards across at the widest point, and it runs deep, with a creek running through it and a lot of overhanging rhododendron, dense forest. The kind of place where fog doesn't clear out until the middle of the day, even when it's sunny, on the ridges above you. I probably hiked into Bone Valley 15, maybe 20 times during my years doing backcountry patrol. It's one of my assigned territories. You go in twice a season. Once in spring to check conditions and mark any downed trees. Once in fall to make sure the trail's still clear. Maybe 20 hikers a year use that trail, if that. Most people who come to the Smokies stay on the popular routes. Cades Cove, Laurel Falls, Charlie's Bunyan. Nobody wants to work for 6 miles uphill to see a narrow valley with fog in it. But here's what I want to tell you first. In the 2 years before what happened to me, 4 people had been found on or near that trail in a confused state. 4 separate incidents. All 4 said the same thing. They couldn't remember hours of their hike. One was a woman from Chapel Hill who did the trail with her husband. They made it about 2 miles in together. Then he looked back and she was gone. He backtracked and found her sitting on a rock half a mile back down the trail, completely disoriented. She said she'd only been sitting there a few minutes. He said she'd been gone for 3 hours. Another time, a guy from Knoxville was found by a ranger coming down the trail looking totally dazed, walking crooked. The ranger asked him how far he'd gotten, and the guy said maybe a mile. The ranger's GPS showed he was 3.5 miles in. The guy had scratches all the way up his arms, deep ones, like he'd pushed through heavy brush. He had no memory of getting them. Another incident. A woman was found near the trailhead with a bloody nose. No idea where it came from. All of these incidents got logged as dehydration or altitude-related confusion. People get disoriented in the backcountry. It happens. Usually it's because they're pushing too hard, not eating right, not drinking enough water. The medical teams checked them out. Nothing was wrong. They all went home with a story about how they got a little foggy on the trail. My supervisor at the time was a woman named Deborah Watts. She's been with the park for 23 years. She's not the type to get excited about things. When I asked her about the incidents, she didn't seem surprised. She just seemed tired. "How many times have you been in there?" she asked me. "Bone Valley? Maybe 15 times. "Don't ask me what I think," she said. "I'm just going to tell you to stay out until we figure out what's happening." That should have been my hint. The first time something actually happened to me in Bone Valley was on October 3rd. I went in for a routine fall patrol, checked the trail for storm damage, cut back some branches that were hanging down too far. Took some pictures for the condition report. It was a beautiful day. Cool, sunny, the leaves just starting to turn. The kind of day that makes you remember why you took the job in the first place. I went in on the main trail like always. About 2 miles in, where the valley narrows and the ridges close in on both sides, the light changes. It gets dimmer because the trees are taller there and the walls of the ridge block the sun. And it gets quieter. That's the thing about valleys. Sound doesn't travel the same way. You hear your own footsteps and the creek and not much else. That's when I felt it. I didn't hear a sound. It wasn't like hearing something. It was more like a pressure. Like the air around me got heavier. My ears felt full. You know that feeling when you drive up a mountain and you get that pressure change in your ears? That sensation where you feel like you need to pop your ears? It was exactly like that, except I hadn't gained any elevation. I checked my altimeter. Nothing. I was at the same elevation I'd been at for the last mile. I kept walking. I remember thinking maybe I was coming down with a cold. Maybe my sinuses were acting up. But the pressure didn't go away. It just stayed there. This constant heavy feeling in my head. My temples felt tight. I hiked to the turnaround point, which is about 3 miles in. By then, the pressure had eased a little. I was thinking I'd just head back and log my observations and grab lunch at the station, and that should have been it. But when I got back to my truck and checked my GPS log, the GPS unit I always carry because it tracks my routes and distance for the official record, I saw something that made my stomach drop. According to the GPS, I had not gone 3 miles in on the main trail and 3 miles back out. The GPS showed that I had gone 2 miles in on the trail, then veered off trail to the southwest. And then I had walked, in a straight line, no deviation, 4 miles through dense forest with no trail. Then I had turned around and come back. I had done that without knowing it. I sat in my truck for maybe 10 minutes, just staring at the GPS unit, looking at the track on the screen. 2 miles in, 4 miles off trail, due southwest. So precise, it looked like someone had drawn it with a ruler. Then back. My boots were dirty. That wasn't unusual. But when I looked closer, the dirt was different on one side. Red clay, the kind you get deep in the cave systems. Not the brown leaf litter you get near the surface. Deep clay. I checked the time log. I had been inside the valley for 3 hours total. It felt like 20 minutes. I drove straight to the ranger station and found Deborah in her office doing paperwork. I told her what had happened. I showed her the GPS data. I told her about the pressure in my ears, the feeling that something wasn't right. She listened without interrupting. Then she closed her eyes for a moment and rubbed her face. "You only went in once," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah, just the patrol. Don't go back." She leaned forward. "I'm serious, Chris. Do not go back into that valley." "What's happening?" I asked her. "I don't know for sure. But I know there was a ranger before you. Todd Renfro. He was the backcountry guy before you transferred in. He had the same thing happen. Same type of incident. He did it 3 times before he requested a transfer to Shenandoah. I have his phone number if you want to talk to him." I took the number. That night, I called it. Todd picked up on the 3rd ring. I identified myself and explained what had happened to me. When I finished, there was a long silence. "How many times did you go in?" he finally asked. "Once, just today." "Then you got lucky," he said. "The first time, you lose a couple of hours. Maybe you wander off trail, maybe you don't. After that, it gets worse." "What do you mean worse?" "The second time I went in, I lost a whole day," Todd said. His voice sounded thin. "I went in for a 4-hour patrol, came out, and it was the next morning. I was at my truck. My boots were shredded, like worn down flat from walking. Constant walking. My hands were raw. There was clay under my fingernails. Red clay, like I'd been in the caves. The caves are sealed. I know. I didn't know what to say to that. The 3rd time," Todd continued, "I went in for what I thought was going to be a 2-hour supply run. Saturday morning. When I woke up, it was Monday. I was in my truck. My supervisor found me there. 2 days, Chris. 2 full days, and I don't have a single memory of any of it." "Did you go back after that?" "No. I requested a transfer 2 weeks later. I haven't been back to the park since." We didn't talk much after that. But before we hung up, he said one more thing. "Don't go back in." Whatever is happening in that valley, it doesn't want to be understood. And the more you go back, the more time you lose. Eventually, you won't come back at all. I should have let it go after that. I should have just avoided Bone Valley and finished my time with the park without pushing. But I couldn't stop thinking about those GPS tracks. I couldn't stop thinking about the 4 hikers who had lost hours with no explanation. So I called Paula Stokes. Paula is 52 years old. She's a retired high school science teacher from Maryville. She's been doing volunteer work with the park for about 3 years. Monitoring backcountry trail conditions, logging things like erosion, water damage, vegetation problems. She goes out twice a month on different trails, taking notes and pictures. She's sharp, smarter than most of the rangers I know, and she actually cares about the details. She had been monitoring Bone Valley. When I called her, she said she'd noticed something odd on her last visit, the one that had happened 3 days before I went in. There are new paths, she said, off the main trail. They're not wide or anything, but they're definitely there. And they're fresh. No decomposition, no dead leaves yet. Like they've been made in the last few weeks. They all go the same direction. Which direction? Southwest. Into the valley, away from the main trail, all in a line. Paula and I hiked into Bone Valley together on October 8th. We didn't go deep. We stopped at about a quarter mile in, just past where the trail enters the wider part of the valley. That's when she took out the device. Paula had kept some equipment from her teaching days. One of them was a sound level meter, a handheld device that measures noise in decibels. She'd been using it to log ambient noise levels on the trails, checking if the park was getting louder from trail usage or road noise from outside the park boundaries. She turned it on and held it up. The reading was normal, about 40 decibels. That's what you'd expect for a relatively quiet forest environment. Then she handed me the meter and told me to walk further into the valley, just about 50 yards further in. I did. I could feel the pressure starting again as soon as I moved deeper. That heavy feeling in my head. I stopped about 50 yards in and waited. Paula watched the meter from her position. "The needle's moving," she called out. "You're getting a spike on low frequency, 14 hertz. "What does that mean?" I called back. "That means something is emitting infrasound, below what human ears can normally hear, but powerful enough to register on equipment. Come back." I walked back to her. The pressure eased. "It stopped," she said, watching the meter. "When you moved back here, the reading dropped to normal." "What produces infrasound like that?" I asked. "Wind, sometimes. Geological settling. Vibration from water moving through rock, but..." She was looking at the valley. "I don't know what produces it this consistently. I've never seen a signal that stable. It's almost mechanical." That's when I decided to go deeper. I'm not sure why. Curiosity, I guess. The feeling that if I understood what was happening, I could control it. I'd learned since then that that's not always true. I drove to the regional office and pulled the historical records. The park keeps archives of all the old CCC work from the 1930s. Civilian Conservation Corps guys built most of the early trails and infrastructure in the Smokies. A lot of that work is documented. I found the entry for Bone Valley, October 1934. The work order said, "Seal cave entrance, structural instability, ceiling compromised." Pretty straightforward. A cave entrance was sealed because of safety concerns. But then I found something stapled behind the work order. A handwritten note. Worn paper, fountain pen ink, the handwriting of an old foreman. It said, "Boys don't want to go back in. Say they hear singing that isn't singing. Lost Hendricks for 6 hours inside. Found him at the back wall drawing circles in the clay with his fingers. He can't remember any of it. Sealing entrance per supervisor's orders. Better this way." That was the whole note. No explanation. No details about what the singing was, or what kind of circles Hendricks had drawn, or why the foreman thought sealing the cave was better. But it was from 1934, and it was describing the exact same thing that had happened to me. The exact same thing that had happened to Todd. The exact same thing that had happened to all those hikers. Lost time. Memories gone. Clay under fingernails. I called Dr. Neil Combs at the University of Tennessee. He's an audiologist in the speech and hearing department. I'd met him once at a park educational event where he'd done a presentation about wildlife sounds. I figured if anyone would understand infrasound and what might be producing it, it would be him. I told him about the readings Paula had taken. I didn't tell him the full story yet, just that we'd detected consistent infrasound in a valley, and I needed to understand what it was. He was skeptical but interested. He said he could bring some professional equipment out to the park if we wanted to do a more detailed recording session. I told him yes, immediately. I didn't tell Deborah. I didn't want to be told not to do this. Combs came out 3 days later with a setup that looked like something you'd use to study volcanoes. Directional microphones, a seismograph, recording equipment that could pick up vibrations in the ground and in the air. He set everything up just outside the valley entrance. Then he sent in a small recording drone on a line, not a person, just a device about the size of a shoebox, tethered on a cable, with sensors on all sides. We let it record for 30 minutes. When Combs pulled it back and checked the data, his expression changed. The infrasound is definitely there, he said. 14 hertz, just like your friend detected. But look at this. He showed me the audio graph on his laptop. The signal wasn't random. It was pulsing. And the pulses were regular. Not just regular, but mathematically precise. It pulses every 7 minutes and 12 seconds, Combs said. Exactly. No variation. I'm looking at a 30-minute recording, and the interval is the same every single time. That's impossible, I said. It's not impossible, but natural sources don't do this. Wind doesn't pulse with precision. Geological settling doesn't either. Water moving through caves. Sometimes you get harmonic resonance, but it varies. This, he was shaking his head, this is either mechanical or it's biological. Biological? Something alive. Something that's producing a sound on purpose, with intent. I felt the temperature drop, even though it was still a warm October afternoon. Could someone be producing it? I asked. Could there be equipment down there? Possible, Combs said. But why? What would anyone be using infrasound equipment for in the middle of a national park? And more importantly, he pointed at the drone. That cable is steel, very conductive. If there was any significant electrical equipment down there, we'd see electromagnetic signatures. We don't. Whatever is producing this, it's not running on electricity. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the handprints in my head, about the caves, about people losing days, about the CCC foreman writing better this way, about sealing a cave. I was parked in my truck at the Bone Valley trailhead. I wasn't supposed to be there. It was late, after midnight, and park facilities close at dark. But I wanted to be close to the place, to think. I had my notebook out, working on my own summary of everything that had happened. At 2:14 a.m., my windshield started vibrating. It was subtle at first, just a fine tremor, the kind of vibration you feel more than you see. I put my hand on the glass and felt it clearly. A hum, traveling through the window, traveling through the whole truck. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then it stopped. When the vibration ended, I looked up from my notebook and toward the valley entrance. There were flashlights, 3 or 4 of them, I thought, moving through the trees, heading southwest, away from the main trail. They were moving at a steady pace, like someone on a walk. Deliberate, controlled, moving in a straight line. At 2 a.m., in a valley where camping isn't allowed and where no one should be out at night. I radioed dispatch immediately. I identified myself and my location and said I had visual contact with hikers in an off-limits area after hours. Dispatch came back. Stand by. Checking for issued permits. It took maybe 2 minutes, though it felt longer. No permits issued for Bone Valley, dispatch said. No one should be in the backcountry tonight. Do you have visual confirmation? Copy, I said. I have multiple flashlights, moving southwest into the valley, approximately 100 yards from my position. Advise caution. We can get rangers to you in approximately 35 minutes. Stand by. I told them I was going to make contact. They told me to be careful. Then I turned off my radio. I didn't want the sound giving me away, and I started following the lights. I didn't turn on my own headlamp. I navigated by moonlight and by keeping the flashlights in sight ahead of me. The terrain was rough and I took it slow. The last thing I needed was to step in a hole and break my ankle. But the people ahead of me, whatever they were doing, they just kept walking. Same pace, same direction, never stopping, never hesitating. After about a mile, the flashlights stopped. I got close enough to see them through the trees, and my skin went cold. There were 4 people standing in a small clearing. Each one was holding a flashlight, each one was facing the exact same direction, southwest. And none of them were moving. They weren't talking. They weren't looking around. They were just standing there, still as statues, their flashlights pointed ahead into the darkness. I recognized one of them. His name was Gary Brennan. He worked part-time doing trail maintenance for the park. He'd been on medical leave for 3 weeks. I knew his address was in Gatlinburg. Gatlinburg is 40 minutes from this trailhead. In his truck, maybe 45 minutes if you're going the back way. He was standing in Bone Valley in his pajamas at 2:30 in the morning, holding a flashlight, staring at nothing. I called out, "Gary!" None of them moved. I called again, louder. Still nothing. Nothing. It was like they couldn't hear me at all. I approached Gary and put my hand on his shoulder. His shirt was cold, not like he was cold-blooded, like his body had been exposed to the air long enough to match the temperature around him. His eyes were open. His chest was moving. He was breathing. But there was nothing behind his eyes. Nobody home. "Gary, it's Chris Haney. Can you hear me?" He didn't respond. None of them responded, and that's when I heard it, the hum. Not through my ears, not like a sound I was hearing. It was inside my head. Deep, low. A pressure that filled my skull, the way water fills a glass. And with the pressure came a direction. A pull, southwest, toward where they were walking. My feet started moving. I didn't decide to move them. I was watching my body move toward the other people like I was disconnected from it. Like I was in the passenger seat instead of the driver's seat. I took 4 steps. Then something in my brain caught up with what was happening, and I grabbed onto a tree. I wrapped my arm around it and pulled myself back. Every step away from the hum felt like I was walking against a current. Like there was a rope around my waist, pulling me back toward the sound. Gary and the others started walking again. All at once, all at the same speed, all moving southwest. Mechanical, like they were extensions of something else's will. I stood at that tree with my arm wrapped around it, and my nose started bleeding. Blood running down my face, hot. And I couldn't feel it at first, just saw it dripping onto my shirt. The hum was still in my head, but it was fading. Like someone was turning down the volume. The pull was easing. I stayed at that tree until I couldn't feel the hum anymore. Until the pressure in my skull was gone. Then I ran. I ran back toward the trailhead, back toward my truck. I fell twice, scraped my hands and knees. I didn't care. I wanted to be out of that valley. I wanted to be driving away from that place. When I got to the station, it was about 4 a.m. I parked and went inside and woke up Deborah. We went back at dawn. Deborah called the park superintendent before we left. I don't know what she told him, but he authorized her to do a full investigation of the area. He also told her to keep it quiet. The 4 of us went in, Deborah, me, a ranger named Marcus, and a seasonal employee named Josh. We hiked to the clearing where I'd seen the 4 people. The clearing was empty, but the ground was disturbed. 4 sets of footprints, all heading southwest, all in a straight line. We followed them, half a mile further in. The main trail system ended and we were in what was basically unmarked wilderness. That's when we saw it. The cave entrance. It was sealed. Concrete. Old concrete. Weathered by decades, but still solid. A wall of gray CCC concrete, blocking what would have been the opening. The concrete was maybe 10 feet wide and 8 feet tall, anchored to the rock on both sides. And on the inside of the concrete, there were handprints. Fresh ones. They were pressed into the concrete as if someone, or something, had pushed from the inside. Not violent pushes, just impressions of hands and fingers, like they were touching the concrete, trying to make contact. And there weren't 4 sets. There were dozens. Maybe more. Hands of different sizes, children's hands, adult hands, all pressed against the inside of the concrete. Deborah put her hand up and compared her palm to one of the prints. The print was slightly larger than her hand. The fingers were longer. No one said anything for a long time. Gary was found the next morning. A deputy in Gatlinburg found him sitting in a Waffle House at 7 a.m. He was wearing his pajamas. He had a cup of coffee in front of him that was cold. When they asked him who he was and how he got there, he couldn't remember. He couldn't remember leaving his house. He couldn't remember driving to Gatlinburg. He couldn't remember anything after going to bed the night before. They brought him in for medical evaluation. Every test came back normal. Blood work normal. Brain scans normal. Blood pressure normal. He was healthy. He just couldn't remember. Under his fingernails, red clay. I filed a full report, 30 pages, documenting everything. The GPS data, the sound recordings, the historical records, the handprints, all of it. I included Combs's analysis of the infrasound. I included photos of the footprints and the sealed cave. The park superintendent read it. He made a phone call. The next day, he called Deborah into his office and told her that Bone Valley was being closed to all access, staff and public, indefinitely. Trail rehabilitation, no timeline. No one was allowed in except during official administrative closure evaluations, and even then, only with express authorization from his office. I asked about the handprints. I asked about Gary. I asked about what we should tell the hikers who come in asking about the trail. The trail is being rehabilitated, the superintendent said. That's the answer. But people need to understand what happened. Chris, he looked at me. The trail is being rehabilitated. That is all anyone needs to understand. I requested a transfer about a month later. Deborah tried to talk me out of it, but I was done. I couldn't go back into the backcountry. Every time I even thought about a valley, or a forest, or a place where I couldn't see the sky, I felt the pressure starting. Even now, I don't go into heavy cover. I don't park in dark places. I don't listen to low frequencies. The park offered me a desk job in visitor services. I took it. The pay is the same. I have regular hours. I don't have to be alone in the wilderness anymore. About 3 months after Bone Valley was closed, it was January now, middle of winter. I was driving home through Gatlinburg at night. I was coming from Knoxville, heading south through town on my way to my place outside the park. I hit a red light on the main strip. I was the first car in the turn lane, turning right toward the park. The light was red for maybe 30 seconds. Long enough for me to notice the car next to me in the straight-ahead lane. It was a sedan. The windows were dark, tinted, or dirty. The headlights were on, but they weren't aimed at the road ahead. They were pointed south, toward the park. The driver was a woman. She was gripping the steering wheel with both hands. She was staring straight ahead at nothing. She was wearing pajamas. I looked behind her. There was another car, headlights on, pointing south. And behind that one, another car. Same thing. Headlights on, pointing south. Driver sitting perfectly still, pajamas. And one more behind that. 4 cars total. All in the right turn and straight lanes. All heading toward the park. All with their drivers sitting perfectly still in pajamas. All with their headlights pointing south at 1 in the morning. The light turned green. None of them moved. I turned right toward the park. In my mirror, I watched them sitting there at the red light. Not moving, just waiting. The light eventually turned red again. I watched them through the intersection as I drove away. I watched as long as I could see them. They never moved. I don't know what's in Bone Valley. I don't know what was calling to those people. I don't know if it's still calling, or if it stopped, or if it's calling to new people now. The park won't release any information about what they found or what the rehabilitation consists of. The cave is still sealed as far as I know. People still go missing in the Smokies every year, and some of them are never found. I still think about that hum. I still feel it sometimes, in that space between sleeping and waking. That pressure in my skull, that pull toward southwest. I don't sleep well. I don't drive through Gatlinburg at night anymore either. And I wonder sometimes about all those people in all those cars, sitting in lanes pointing toward the park, waiting for a light that will take them there. I wonder if they ever made it down to Bone Valley. I wonder if they're still down there, walking in a straight line, their feet moving and moving and moving, their minds somewhere else entirely, drawing circles in red clay in the dark. I wonder if they ever came back out. I found the first one on a Tuesday. That sounds like nothing. Like the beginning of any story you've heard 100 times. But you need to understand, I've worked these mountains for 14 years, and in all that time, I've never seen an animal positioned like that. Not like that. Not arranged. My name is Rhonda Kessler. I'm a Forest Service ranger out of the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. Cranberry Wilderness District. I'm telling you this because I've kept quiet about it for long enough, and I'm not going to do that anymore. It happened last November. I was running my usual patrols out of the ranger station in Richwood, managing about 80 square miles of some of the oldest forest left in the eastern United States. Red spruce mostly, mixed with hemlock and some hardwoods lower down. The cranberry wilderness is remote. You get hikers in the fall, but by November, they're mostly gone. It was just me and the occasional hunter, and the hunters don't venture far from the parking areas. Brian Pruitt showed up the second week of November. He was a wildlife biologist working for USC, doing a black bear population survey. Young guy, maybe 29, smart on paper. He had all the credentials and all the equipment, but he had that look about him. The look of someone who'd read plenty of books about the wilderness, but hadn't actually spent much time in it. He showed up in Richwood in the middle of a cold rain, driving a Ford Escape that he'd packed so full of camera traps and hair snares that you could barely see out the back window. I met him at the ranger station to walk him through the area. He wanted to set up in Gauley Hollow, a deep valley in the middle of my district. It's beautiful country, old-growth forest so thick that on an overcast day it feels like late evening, even at noon. The hollow had everything he needed. Isolated, good bear habitat, easy water access from the stream at the bottom. I warned him about the usual stuff. Flash floods in the hollows when the weather turns. Hypothermia sets in faster than you'd think when you're wet and the temperature drops. The spruce thickets up on the ridge can disorient you if you're not careful. The trees grow so dense you can only see about 30 feet in any direction, and the terrain all looks the same. I told him to check his radio battery every morning and to call in at dusk, whether anything had happened or not. He listened, but he didn't really hear me. You could tell by the way he was already thinking about his work, running through his checklist in his head while I was talking. I helped him set up his base camp near the hollow entrance. Then I left him to it. 3 days later, he radioed me. He'd found something he wanted to show me. I was about 4 miles away, checking a trail that had washed out in a storm, so it took me another hour to hike back to Gauley Hollow. Brian met me at the trail junction. He looked confused more than anything else. "It's a fox," he said. "Dead, but I think you should see it." We hiked in about 50 yards. The ground was covered in moss and fallen spruce needles, wet and soft from the rain. The air smelled like wet earth and decay, the way it always does in the forest in late fall. Nothing unusual. Then I saw it. The fox was lying on its right side. Its forelegs were extended straight out, not bent. Not in any natural position a dead animal takes. The front legs pointed west. The back legs pointed east, and its head, this was the part that bothered me. Its head was turned so the nose pointed directly north. It was too precise, too deliberate, like someone had arranged it. "Find it like that?" I asked. "Yes," Brian said. 2 days ago. I marked it on my map because I wanted to get back to check on it, see if anything would scavenge it. That's unusual, isn't it? Nothing has touched it. I knelt down. The ground around the fox was warm. I could feel it radiating up through my pants leg before I even touched it. I put my hand flat on the soil. It was probably 85, maybe 90 degrees. In November, that's not normal. Not normal at all. "How long has it been warm?" I asked. "Since I found it," Brian said. "I checked it yesterday, and it was the same. I thought maybe it was maggot heat, but I don't see any maggots. I don't see any insects at all." I pulled out my field notebook and sketched the location, marked the coordinates. "Could be a sinkhole with geothermal activity," I said. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The hollow had no geothermal features. Nobody had ever reported anything like that. "That's what I thought," Brian said. "But look," he pointed at the fox. I looked closer. Where the fox's body met the ground, there were fine white threads coming up from the soil. They were barely visible, thin as hair, running from the earth up into the fox's fur and skin. I'd never seen anything like it. "What is that?" Brian asked. I picked at the threads with my fingernail. They were fragile, delicate. They pulled loose easily, and where they came free, there were tiny red marks on the fox's skin, like a mild chemical burn. "I don't know," I said. That's what I should have said to the Forest Service. That's what I should have said to someone in authority. "I don't know. It warrants investigation." Instead, I photographed it, made some notes, and told Brian to keep an eye on it. I was thinking it was probably nothing. Maybe some kind of unusual fungal growth, maybe parasites. I've been doing this job long enough to know that nature does strange things sometimes, and usually there's a reasonable explanation. I was wrong. 4 days later, Brian came running to find me. Literally running. I was back at the ranger station doing paperwork when I heard him on the radio, breathing hard, asking me to meet him at the hollow entrance. Something in his voice made me drop what I was doing. He was pale when I got there. He handed me a tablet. It was one of his trail cameras, the kind that runs on batteries and records whenever motion triggers the sensor. He'd been reviewing footage from the network of cameras he'd set up across the hollow. I started watching the first day, he said, just to see what animals came through. Deer, mostly. Some raccoons, squirrels, normal stuff. But starting on day 3, something changed. He played the footage. It was night vision, all gray and green. A young buck wandered into the camera's field of view, walked around for a while, and then just stopped. It lay down on its right side. The front legs extended, the back legs extended. The head turned so the nose pointed north. Then it didn't move. The footage ran for 4 more hours, and the deer never moved once. That's one camera, Brian said. He pulled up another. Same thing. A raccoon walking normally, then stopping mid-stride, lying down in the exact same position. Legs out, head north, not moving. How many? I asked. 31 across 8 cameras over 4 days, he said. All in the same position, all in the same part of the hollow. And Rhonda, look at the timestamps. They all lie down at different times, but once they do, they never get up. The batteries on the cameras last for weeks. I'm watching some of these animals for 8, 10, 12 hours. They're breathing. I can see their flanks moving, but they never stand up. They never move. I looked at him. Is the camera footage clear? Could something be wrong with it? I checked 3 different cameras, different angles, different species, same behavior every time, he said. It's real. Whatever this is, it's real. I told him I needed to see it in person. We went in the next morning at dawn. The warm zone around the original fox had expanded. It was now about 5 feet across instead of 3. The fox itself was still there, lying in the exact same position. The white threads had grown thicker, and they'd actually started pulling the fox slightly into the ground. You could see the soil had risen up slightly around the fox's right side, like the earth was swallowing it very slowly. It's been happening over 2 weeks, I said quietly. The warm spot's been growing. It's expanding. We hiked deeper into the hollow, into the oldest part of the forest, where the spruce trees had been growing for over 200 years. The trees here are massive, 6 feet across the base, so tall you have to crane your neck to see where they end. The ground beneath them is usually bare, except for a thin layer of needles, because so little light gets through. The shade is so deep that nothing else grows. But the ground here had changed. It was like walking on a thick carpet. The soil had been replaced with a mat of interwoven white and tan threads, probably 6 inches thick. It covered the forest floor like fungal webbing. The mat was cohesive and tough. You couldn't just push your foot through it. The trees still grew out of it, but their base trunks were covered in the same white threads, creeping up the bark like roots growing in reverse. I knelt down and tried to pull a piece of the mat loose. It resisted. I had to work at it, pulling hard, and when I finally tore a section free, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. The underside of the mat wasn't white. It was pink, almost flesh-colored, and it was warm like a living thing. "What is that?" Brian whispered. "We need to leave," I said. We hiked out without talking. My mind was moving through possibilities, and none of them made sense. I'd read about mycorrhizal networks, fungi that connect to tree roots and help the trees get nutrients. The news had been full of stories about the wood wide web, how trees talk to each other through fungal connections underground. But those networks are microscopic. You don't see them. You don't walk on them. And they don't have color. They're not pink. That afternoon, I drove out to visit Alma Nestor. Alma lives in a cabin about a mile from Gauley Hollow, right at the edge of the national forest. She's owned that piece of land for most of her life, and her family owned it before that. Her father worked in the coal mines. Her grandfather before him. She kept bees and grew vegetables and lived alone. She didn't like visitors, which is why most people left her alone. But I needed to ask her something. She was sitting on her porch despite the cold, watching the tree line. She didn't seem surprised to see me. She poured coffee from a thermos and handed me a cup without asking if I wanted it. "Something's wrong in the hollow," I said. She didn't answer right away. She looked toward the trees, where Golly Hollow was about a mile away through the forest. "My grandmother called it the hungry ground," she finally said. She grew up in Elkins, but her family had ties to this whole area. She told me stories about the hollow, about how the ground there was different, how it would wake up sometimes. "Wake up," I repeated. Every so often, maybe every few decades, the ground would get soft and warm. Things would happen in the hollow that didn't happen other places. She said the ground eats slow. Leaves first, then small animals, then bigger ones. She said anything that lay down on the warm ground too long wouldn't get back up. I put the coffee down. "What happens to them?" Alma turned to look at me. She was 78 years old, and her eyes were very clear. "They go down," she said, "into the ground. The ground takes them in. You ever see a wound heal? Skin grows over a cut? It's like that. The ground closes over them." I didn't know what to do with that information. It sounded like folklore, the kind of story old people tell, and usually they have no basis in fact. But it also sounded like someone describing something that had actually happened. "Is there anything else?" I asked. "Anything else your grandmother told you?" She said, "Once it starts, it spreads," Alma said. "Slow at first, then faster. And once it gets people inside it, you can't stop it." I left shortly after. I didn't have any more questions, and I don't think Alma had any more answers. That night, I couldn't sleep. I was camped about half a mile from Golly Hollow, in a spot where I usually stay when I'm doing extended patrols. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up because I felt warm. My sleeping pad was warm. Not from me, from below. The ground underneath my tent was radiating heat. I got out of my sleeping bag and put my hand flat on the ground outside the tent. It was at least 80 degrees. I'd been here 2 weeks ago and the ground had been cold. Now it was warm, a half mile from the hollow. I packed up in the dark and moved my camp to a ridgetop about a mile away. The ground there was cold, normal, but I didn't sleep anymore that night. The next morning, I called my supervisor. His name was Martin Coulter. He'd been with the Forest Service for 32 years, and he didn't rattle easily. I explained what we'd found, the unusual animal behavior, the warm ground, the white threads in the soil. "I'm going to send someone out," he said. "A biologist from the regional office. Don't go back into that hollow until they can assess it." The biologist arrived 2 days later. His name was Dr. Vince Salvador, and he worked for USCIS. He was young, maybe mid-30s, with a very precise way of speaking. He brought equipment with him, soil testing kits, spectrometers, bags for samples. He wanted to see everything. I showed him the warm zone around the original fox, the expanded perimeter, the mat in the deeper part of the hollow. He spent about 3 hours collecting samples and taking readings. He didn't say much while he was working. When he was done, he packed everything up very carefully. "I need to take these back for analysis," he said. "What do you think it is?" I asked. "I don't know," he said. He looked at me directly when he said it. "But I'd recommend keeping people out of that area until we can identify it." 2 days after that, Martin called me into his office. He handed me a notice of area closure. Golly Hollow was being closed to all public access, effective immediately. It was also being closed to all Forest Service staff without explicit authorization from regional headquarters. "It's precautionary," he said, "until we know what we're dealing with." Did Dr. Salvador say what it was? He said it's not in any database he can find. He's sending samples to the CDC and to a mycology specialist at West Virginia University. They're going to take a look. "And in the meantime?" I asked. Martin looked tired. "In the meantime, we keep people out and we wait." He also reassigned me. Effective immediately, I was moving to a different district, about 60 miles east. They needed coverage there, and my experience would be valuable. It was a lateral move. No demotion, but it was also pretty clear that I was being moved away from the problem. I asked for 1 more day in my current district. Martin approved it. I wanted to talk to Alma 1 more time. I drove out to her cabin late that afternoon. The sun was setting, and it was cold. The way November gets when you know winter is coming, and it's not far off. Alma was still on her porch, This time she wasn't watching the trees. She was looking at her bee boxes. 3 of them sat about 30 feet from her cabin. They were arranged in a line along the edge of her property, right where the forest started. "My bees are gone," she said, before I even asked. I walked over to the boxes and looked inside the open hive. The bees were there, hundreds of them, but they weren't buzzing or moving. They were lying down on the frames in rows, on their right sides, legs extended, all facing the same direction, toward the forest, toward Goli Hollow. "When did it start?" I asked. "Last night," Alma said. "I was out here, and I saw them coming back to the hive like normal. Then they started acting weird. They flew in circles for a while. Then they just laid down. They're still alive. I can see them breathing. But they won't move. They won't eat. They won't do anything." I called Martin from her cabin. I told him what we'd found. "The warm zone," he said. "It's reached her property?" "I don't think so," I said. I put my hand on the ground outside her cabin. "It's cold. But the bees?" I didn't finish. I didn't know what the bees meant. "Stay there," Martin said. "Don't go near the forest. I'm going to send someone out." But by the time someone arrived, the bees were all gone, not dead, not disappeared. They just weren't there anymore. The hive frames were empty, except for a few empty cells and some honey. Alma said she found one bee that had fallen to the ground near the hive. It was still moving, still breathing, but it was half embedded in the soil, sinking slowly into the earth. We didn't try to stop it. The hazmat team arrived the next morning. They came in 3 trucks and set up a perimeter around Goli Hollow. They wore full protective suits, the kind with breathing apparatus, the kind you wear when you're dealing with something that might kill you just by breathing the air. They had portable laboratory equipment. They had cameras and recording devices. They looked like something out of a science fiction movie, walking through the beautiful old-growth forest in their white suits. I wasn't allowed past the perimeter. Martin told me that my district assignment had been accelerated. I was to leave that day. But he knew I wanted to watch them work, so he let me stand at the boundary and observe. They were setting up various instruments around the edge of the warm zone, taking readings, recording data. After about an hour, one of the team members, I could tell by his suit markings that he was someone in charge, walked to the edge of the mat. He stood very still, looking down at it. The white and tan threads visible through the thin layer of fallen needles. The barely there surface of something that shouldn't exist. His colleagues were moving around him, working. I could see them through their helmet visors, talking on radios. One of them called his name. I heard it come through on the Forest Service radio. "Dr. Patterson, can you move away from the edge? We need to set up equipment there." But Dr. Patterson didn't move. He just stood there, very still, looking down at the mat, looking down at the fungal network that was spreading under the mountain. "Dr. Patterson?" Another colleague came closer to him. I watched his head tilt, very slightly, like he was examining something, like something had caught his attention, like he was listening to something nobody else could hear. Then his colleague touched his arm and he walked back. I saw him speak into his radio, but I couldn't hear what he said. I packed my things that afternoon and drove east to my new district. 6 months later, I got a phone call. It was Marcus Webb, a ranger from the district adjacent to my old one. He was calling from his ranger station, and his voice was careful, like he was choosing his words very carefully. "I wanted you to know, before it gets reported through official channels," he said. "We found something in my district, about 9 miles from Goli Hollow." I didn't say anything. I already knew what he was going to tell me. "The ground is warm," he continued. "About a quarter acre so far, and there are white threads in it, just like you wrote in your incident report. There's also a dead raccoon, lying on its side, legs extended, head pointing north." I closed my eyes. "It's spreading," he said. "Yeah," I said. "It is." "What do we do?" he asked. I didn't have an answer. Nobody did. The hazmat team was still at Goli Hollow, still running tests, still trying to understand what they were dealing with. The samples had gone to specialists. The data had been analyzed, but I never heard any official announcement about what it was or how to stop it. 6 months of silence. 6 months of people in suits, measuring and testing and recording. And still it spread. I've thought about this a lot. I've thought about what Alma said, that it eats slow, that it starts with leaves and small animals, And if it ever reaches people, it can't be stopped. I've thought about Dr. Patterson standing at the edge of the mat, perfectly still, like something was calling to him from underneath the earth. I don't work in the mountains anymore. I took early retirement. I live near Charleston now, in a flat urban area with concrete and buildings and people. I'm far away from the hollow, far away from any forests that might hide what's underneath. But I still think about the ground being warm, about what's underneath it, about how you never really know what's beneath your feet until something goes wrong, about how some things in these mountains have been there longer than any of us, and they're still hungry. And I think about how nobody ever said it couldn't reach other forests. Nobody ever said it was confined to West Virginia. Nobody ever said the spreading would stop. I'm going to tell you about something that doesn't have an explanation. Not one that makes sense, anyway. Not one that anybody in the Park Service is willing to give. I worked as a boundary technician for Shenandoah National Park for 12 years. My job was specific. I maintained the physical markers that define where the park ends and private property begins. Most people don't know that job exists. They think park boundaries are just lines on a map. They're not. They're real. They're brass discs set in concrete, driven into the ground at exact GPS coordinates. Every few years, someone has to go out and check them. Are they still where they're supposed to be? Has anything shifted them? Has anyone tampered with them? It's honest work. Boring, most of the time. The numbers either add up or they don't. My name is Dennis Roark. I'm 45 now. I grew up in Luray, Virginia, just outside the park boundary. My father worked construction. My mother was a nurse. I wasn't planning to work for the Park Service. I was going to do something else. But I studied geography in college, and I had a knack for precision work. And when the job opened up, I took it. It paid decent. It was stable. And Shenandoah was home. The park stretches for about 75 miles along the crest of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's narrow, sometimes only a few miles wide, with the Piedmont dropping away on the east side and the Shenandoah Valley on the west. Skyline Drive runs along the ridgeline for 105 miles, and people love it because the views are incredible. On a clear day, you can see 50 miles in both directions, but the park itself isn't just the ridge. It's a long, skinny piece of mountain with valleys and hollows dropping down on both sides. These hollows are where things get complicated. The hollows in Shenandoah have history, hard history. When the government created the park in the 1930s, they displaced families, hundreds of them, people who had been living in those mountains for generations. Their homes were destroyed. Their graves were moved or abandoned. They were told to leave. Some families had been there since before the United States existed, and then they were gone. You can still find the ruins if you hike off the main trails. Stone chimneys, collapsed foundations, old cemeteries with headstones so worn you can barely read the names. Emmett Sisk's family was one of them, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The specific section where this started was Section 14, Western Boundary, between mile markers 45 and 57 on Skyline Drive. It's a beautiful piece of the park, at least on the surface. The ridge there runs along a series of peaks and small valleys. The western side drops away steep, 5,000 vertical feet down to the valley floor. The boundary line runs along the western edge of the park's official property, where it meets private land owned by families, timber companies, and people with summer homes. The boundary matters legally. If a marker is wrong, if it's off even by a few feet, it creates problems. A landowner might own land they think is theirs, but if the marker has moved, suddenly it's park property. Or the opposite, it's serious business. So we check, regularly. It's part of the job. In late September, I was out doing a routine boundary survey in Section 14. I had a GPS unit accurate to within 2 centimeters. I had the historical coordinates going back to 1985. I was checking each marker against those records, just like I'd done 50 times before. The weather was good, clear, cool, maybe 55 degrees. The fall colors were starting. It was a decent day to be outside. The first 6 markers checked out fine, exactly where they were supposed to be. Marker 7 was off by 4.2 inches. Not a lot. Not enough to notice unless you were looking for it, but off in a specific direction, inward, toward the park interior. I stood there for a minute, looking at my GPS unit, then looking at the marker, just a brass disc embedded in concrete, looking like it had been there forever. Probably frost heave, I thought. The ground freezes in winter and expands, and sometimes it can move things, or erosion, or some combination of factors. These mountains are always shifting, always moving. It's not a problem usually. I note it, and we deal with it. I moved to marker 8, also inward, 5.1 inches. Wrong direction, same amount of drift as marker 7. I checked marker 9, same pattern, 3.8 inches inward. By the time I reached marker 12, I knew something was different. Every marker was off. Every single one was shifted in the same direction, by amounts between 3 and 8 inches. I spent the rest of that day checking the rest of section 14. 23 markers total along that stretch of boundary. All of them inward. All of them drifting toward the same compass bearing, roughly northwest, pointing into the park's interior. I drove back to the ranger station that afternoon and started pulling historical records. Shenandoah keeps meticulous boundary data. Everything is stored in hard files and digital records. I had access to surveys going back to 1975. I spent the next 3 days comparing current marker positions to the old records, comparing the 2023 coordinates to 2013, to 2003, to 1993. The markers had been drifting for at least 40 years. Not randomly, not due to normal erosion or seasonal shifts. They were moving, slowly, consistently, in a single direction. I plotted the data on a map, drawing arrows from old positions to current positions for each marker. The arrows didn't fan out in different directions like you'd expect from random drift. They converged. They all pointed the same way, toward a spot on the western slope of the mountain, about 2 miles inside the park boundary, at roughly 2,800 feet elevation. I remember sitting at my desk, looking at that map, and feeling something tight in my chest. Not quite fear, just recognition that something didn't fit, that the numbers I was looking at didn't match anything I'd been trained to expect. I called Margaret Colvin. Margaret had been a cartographer for the National Park Service for 30 years before she retired. She lived in Front Royal, about 40 minutes away. I'd met her a few times at Park Service gatherings. She was sharp, one of those people who understood not just maps, but what the maps meant, what they revealed. I drove out to see her. I brought my data, printed spreadsheets, maps, GPS readings, historical coordinates, everything. I laid it all out on her kitchen table. She didn't say much while she was looking at it, just made coffee and went through the papers, making notes, occasionally checking something on her computer. After 2 hours, she set down the papers and looked at me. "This isn't erosion," she said. "Dennis, I want to be clear about that. Erosion doesn't work like this. Erosion would move markers in different directions, depending on the slope and the soil type. Erosion would be random, scattered. What you're showing me is 17 different markers on different terrain types, rigid tops, slopes, flat ground, all moving in the same direction at roughly the same rate for 40 years. That doesn't happen naturally." I asked her what could cause it. "I don't know," she said, "but I'll tell you what it looks like. It looks like something is pulling the ground, like a drain in a bathtub, all the water draining toward one point." She tapped the map. "They're all pointing here. Whatever is happening, it's centered here, in this hollow." I'd heard of the hollow, but I'd never been to it. It wasn't marked on any official map. There was no trail leading to it. It didn't have a name. Margaret looked at me. "You need to go there. You need to see what's actually happening." So I did. I went on a Saturday in early October, alone. I told my supervisor I was doing a maintenance hike. I didn't tell him where. The hollow was about 3 miles into the park's interior from Skyline Drive, cross-country through dense forest. No trail meant no easy route. I had a GPS unit and a compass, and I knew the coordinates. I packed water, a camera, a notebook. I brought a thermometer because I wanted to get ground temperature readings. It took me 2 hours to get there, pushing through heavy undergrowth and navigating around deadfall. The last part of the descent was steep. I had to hold onto trees to keep from sliding. The hollow itself was a bowl-shaped depression between 2 ridge lines, maybe a 1/4 mile across. And there were trees. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, and they were arranged in rings. From ground level, you don't notice it right away. The forest just looks like a dense forest. But I'd brought binoculars and a camera, and when I climbed back up the southern ridge and looked down from above, the pattern was unmistakable. Concentric rings of trees, getting progressively denser as they moved inward. The outer rings had big oaks and hickories spaced normally. As the rings got closer to the center, the trees got smaller and more tightly packed. Tulip poplars mostly, the kind that grow in disturbed soil, crowding each other out. At the center was a bare circle. No grass, no moss, no undergrowth. Just dark soil, smooth and unmarked. The circle was maybe 10 feet across, slightly sunken in the middle, like a shallow bowl. Or a mouth. I climbed down into it. The soil was warm. Not hot, just a few degrees above the air temperature, which was maybe 55 degrees. I pulled out my thermometer. The soil registered at 68 degrees. I marked the spot and measured outward. At the first ring of trees, maybe 3 feet away, it was 63 degrees. At the second ring, maybe 50 feet from the center, it was 60 degrees, normal ground temperature, but decreasing as you went inward. I took photographs. I recorded the GPS coordinates. I stood there for probably 20 minutes, just looking at that bare circle, trying to understand what I was looking at. Nothing in my training prepared me for what I was seeing. I didn't know it then, but I would come back to that hollow many more times. I would bring equipment. I would spend entire nights there. I would bring other people, and each time I would learn something new. Each time, something would be different. But on that first visit, I just stood at the edge of that bare circle and felt the warmth coming up from the soil, and understood that whatever the Park Service thought was happening with those survey markers, the cause wasn't any kind of normal erosion or geological movement. I went back to Luray and drove out to Emmett Sisk's property. Emmett lived on family land just outside the park boundary, about 5 miles west of Skyline Drive. His place was a small house with a big porch and a few outbuildings, sitting on maybe 50 acres of forest and pasture. He'd lived there his whole life. His family had lived there for almost 200 years before the park took most of it. I knew Emmett a little bit. Nothing friendly. He wasn't friendly toward the Park Service. Not hostile exactly, but you could feel the old anger there. The resentment that his family's land had been taken, that his grandfather had been told to leave. These feelings didn't go away in a generation or two. They sank into people like smoke. But when I showed up with questions about the hollow, he was willing to talk. We sat on his porch. He was 74 then, lean and weathered, with the kind of hands that had done real work their whole life. He didn't offer me anything to drink. He just sat in a rocking chair and listened. "The hollow that's not on the map," I said. "Between Ridge 2 and Ridge 3, northwest exposure. Do you know about it?" Emmett's face changed. It was subtle, but I saw it. A tightness around the eyes. "My grandfather told me about that place," he said. Said his grandfather told him to stay away from it. Said the ground there moved at night, just a little. Just enough that if you put a fence post in one spring, it would be 6 inches closer to the hollow by next spring. He said the old families all knew about it. All of them. They didn't talk about it much. They just kept their children away, kept their animals away, kept their gardens away. I asked him if he believed that. "I believe my grandfather believed it," Emmett said. "And I believe his grandfather before that. They didn't make things up. They didn't pass down stories that weren't true. If Granddad said the ground moved, then the ground moved." He rocked in his chair for a while, looking out at the mountains. "When the park came," he said, "when the government started making all the families leave, Granddad said it was the first smart thing they'd ever done. He said let them have it, let them have that whole mountain, because something in that hollow was hungry, and if they wanted to give the government problems, it would give the government problems." I didn't know how to respond to that. I just sat there, listening to the wind move through the trees around his house. "You been to the hollow?" Emmett asked. I said I had. "You feel it pulling?" he asked. "I don't know what you mean," I said. "You will," he said. "Give it time." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what Margaret had said, about something pulling the ground. I kept thinking about the way the bare circle felt warm, about the trees arranged in rings, about how completely unnatural the whole thing was. And I kept thinking about what Emmett had said. The ground moved. The hollow was hungry. I knew it was nonsense. I knew there was a rational explanation. There had to be. But I couldn't think of what it would be. A week later, I went back to the hollow at night. I brought a GPS unit set to high accuracy. I found a clear spot at the edge of the bare circle, just a few feet from the inner ring of trees. and I placed the GPS unit on the ground. I marked its exact position with spray paint, marking the concrete-like ground beneath. Then I set an alarm on my phone for every hour and just sat there, watching it, measuring it, checking its position against my marker. At midnight, the GPS unit was exactly where I'd put it. At 1 a.m., it had moved 0.4 inches toward the center. At 2 a.m., it had moved another 0.3 inches. At 3 a.m., 0.35 inches. At 4 a.m., 0.4 inches. By 5 a.m., when the sun started to come up, the GPS unit had moved a total of 1.8 inches toward the center of the bare circle, and I watched it happen. It didn't slide. It didn't tilt or shift suddenly. The ground under it just moved, carrying it the way a conveyor belt carries a package. Smoothly, steadily, imperceptibly, unless you were measuring it with a precise instrument and looking directly at it. When the sun came up, I packed up the GPS unit and hiked out of the hollow. My hands were shaking. Not from cold, from fear. I knew then that I was dealing with something I didn't understand. I drove straight to Margaret's house. She was in her garden, pulling weeds. She looked up when I pulled into the driveway. She must have seen something in my face, because she straightened up immediately and set down her gardening gloves. We didn't talk much on the drive back to the hollow. Margaret brought her own equipment, a total station, which is basically a sophisticated surveying tool, a soil probe, a ground thermometer. She brought a small jar. We spent the entire day taking measurements. Margaret set up her total station at the edge of the bare circle and took precise measurements of the ground surface, the distance from different reference points, everything. She drove the soil probe into the bare circle at different depths, documenting what she found. We measured temperatures at different distances from the center. The pattern held. The ground was warm. 68 degrees at the center, cooling as you moved outward. The rings of trees were mathematically precise in their spacing, and the ground was definitely moving. But what Margaret found in the soil probe changed everything. She drove it down about 4 feet at the edge of the bare circle, and it sank smoothly until something stopped it. Not rock. Something that gave slightly under pressure, like pressing your finger into bread dough and then pushed back. Margaret pulled the probe out slowly. The tip was covered in something that wasn't soil. It was dark, smooth, almost oily. It was warm. She pulled out a cotton swab from her equipment bag and scraped a sample. The substance came away easily, like it was coating the metal. "What is that?" I asked. She didn't answer. She just stood there, looking at the sample on the swab. Then she reached out carefully and touched it with her finger. She pulled her hand back like she'd been burned. "That feels like skin," she said quietly. She put the sample in a glass jar and sealed it. We stood there, watching it. For about a minute, nothing happened. Then, the sample started to move, very slowly. It spread along the inner surface of the glass, reaching upward, like something was testing the edges of the container it had been placed in. "We need to go," Margaret said. "We need to leave now." We left. We didn't hike out slowly and carefully. We moved fast, sometimes climbing rather than walking, pushing through brush that grabbed at our clothes. Neither of us spoke until we were back at the car. When we were driving away, Margaret said, "That's not soil. That's not any geology I know." "What is it?" I asked. "I don't know," she said. "But Dennis, something down there is alive." I filed a report with the Park Service. Comprehensive. All my data about the markers drifting, the GPS measurements from the hollow, the temperature readings, everything. The photographs, the coordinates, everything. My supervisor read it. Didn't say much, just sat quietly for a few minutes. Then he said he needed to make some phone calls. The next day, I was told that Section 14 was being taken off the routine survey schedule. The boundary in that section had been deemed stable and did not require further monitoring at this time. I asked why. He didn't have a good answer, just told me not to worry about it. They had consultants looking at the data. Everything was fine. I should move on to other sections. I didn't move on. I kept going back to the hollow. Not officially. On my own time. On weekends. At night. I measured things. I documented things. I took photographs. The bare circle was getting bigger. The inner rings of trees were dying. And then one day, Emmett Sisk was standing at the edge of his property, looking up at the tree line toward the hollow. I stopped my truck. He didn't say anything until I walked over to him. "That fence post," he said. The one my grandfather put in back in the 1930s. Right before they left, he put it at the boundary line of the family property. The government took the land, so the post ended up inside the park. Government property. But the post kept moving. Year after year, it moved toward the hollow. He pointed up the mountain. I drove up there last spring, he said. Wanted to see if it was still there. It wasn't. The ground had swallowed it up. It's in the hollow now. I'm still at Shenandoah. They didn't transfer me. Nobody asked me to leave. They just stopped asking me to work Section 14. The boundary data I collected got filed, and nobody references it. The hollow stays where it is. The trees keep growing in those rings. The ground keeps moving. And nothing official changed. Everything I reported, everything I documented, it all just got put in a drawer somewhere. Except one thing. About a year after everything went down, I was reviewing satellite images of the park for a completely different project. Just routine stuff. And I got curious. I zoomed in on the hollow. Not the whole area, just the hollow itself. The bare circle had gotten bigger. When I left it, when I walked out of there for the last time, it was about 10 feet across. In the satellite image from 6 months ago, it was 25 feet. The innermost ring of trees, the ones that had been right on the edge of that circle, they were gone, not cut down, gone, like they'd been absorbed. I haven't been back since that satellite image. I don't plan to. Some things, once you understand what they are, you stop looking at them. But I think about that hollow sometimes, especially in the fall, when the leaves are changing. I think about the way the ground felt warm beneath my boots. I think about the way that sample moved inside the glass jar, testing the edges of its container, figuring out the shape of the world around it. And I think about the boundary markers, all those brass discs, slowly being pulled inward, year after year, generation after generation, pointing towards something that's been in those mountains longer than the park has existed, longer than the families that lived there existed. The ground is still moving. I know it is. And somewhere in a file cabinet in the Park Service offices, there's a report with all the measurements, all the data, all the proof. But nobody's looking at it, and nobody's measuring anymore. The boundary keeps drifting inward. The hollow keeps growing. And if you were to add up all those inches, all those movements over those 40 years, and however many more years it will take, eventually the legal boundary of Shenandoah National Park will be completely redrawn. The park itself will be reshaped by forces that nobody in administration wants to acknowledge or understand. I sometimes wonder if that's always been the point. If something in those mountains has always been hungry, and the park, the roads, the visitors, the infrastructure, all of it, was just a temporary inconvenience, something that would eventually be drawn inward and absorbed. But I don't go back to check. I need to tell you something I've never told anyone outside my immediate team, and honestly, I probably shouldn't be telling you now. But it's been 6 years, and I can't be the only person who knows this is still happening. My name is Kyle Draper. I work the night shift on the Blue Ridge Parkway in North Carolina, doing wildlife management and road safety. I've been doing this job for 11 years. Before that, I was Army. I served in Afghanistan. I'm saying this not because it's relevant to the story, but because I need you to understand that I'm not someone who gets spooked easily. I don't believe in things I can't measure or see. I'm the kind of guy who checks his equipment twice and trusts the data in front of him. What I'm about to tell you is completely true. I have no way to prove it to you anymore. The evidence was collected and filed somewhere I don't have access to, but it happened. It's still happening. The Blue Ridge Parkway is 469 miles of mountain road that runs from North Carolina up into Virginia. It's beautiful during the day, the kind of place that draws tourists all year, especially in the fall. But at night, it's something different entirely. There are no streetlights, no gas stations, no towns you can see from the road, just curves and elevation changes, and tunnel after tunnel, all carved straight through the mountain. When you're driving the night shift in October and the fog rolls in, you can't see more than 30 feet ahead of your truck. I work the section near Craggy Gardens, which sits at about 5,500 feet elevation. The road up there climbs from the valley and doesn't level off. It just keeps going up until you're above the tree line in places. That's where you get the balds, which are these open grassy mountaintops with no trees. In October, the grass is gold and the wind is constant. On clear nights, the stars are so bright it almost hurts to look at them. My job during the night shift is pretty straightforward. I drive the road. My section is about 50 miles of parkway, and I look for debris that might be dangerous. Fallen branches, rocks, tree damage. I check the overlooks to make sure nobody's parked there doing something stupid. I document wildlife crossings when I see them, and I listen to the radio in case there's an accident or a lost hiker. Most nights, I don't see much. A few deer, maybe a coyote if I'm lucky. The road is mine, empty and quiet. This particular incident started on a Tuesday in October, around 10 p.m. I was coming around one of the curves near the tunnels at Craggy Gardens. My headlights caught something unusual on the shoulder ahead. A group of white-tailed deer, maybe 5 of them. No bucks. This wasn't strange in itself. Deer stand on the parkway at night all the time. They're attracted to the grass that's been cleared along the road. They browse for a few minutes, usually bolt when they see your lights, and that's the end of it. But these deer didn't move. I slowed down as I approached them. They should have heard my truck. Deer have incredible hearing, but they just stood there. And then I noticed something that made me stop the truck completely. All 5 of them were facing the same direction, east, toward a point up on the ridge that I couldn't see in the dark. Their heads were all angled the same way. Their bodies were aligned. It looked almost like they were lined up to look at something specific. I've been around animals my whole life. I hunted growing up. I've been a ranger for over a decade. I've studied animal behavior as part of my job training, and I'd never seen deer do this. I turned on my spotlight, the big one mounted on the truck, and swept it across the trees and brush beyond the shoulder. My light hit the grass and the tree line. More deer. 2 more groups, spread out further into the fields adjacent to the road, and every single one of them was facing the same direction. I counted 14 deer total, all of them motionless, all facing east. I sat there with my light on them for maybe 30 seconds, trying to figure out what I was looking at. The deer didn't react. They didn't run. They didn't even flinch. They just held their position, completely still, all facing the same angle toward the ridge. Then I drove on. I remember thinking it was weird, but I also wasn't alarmed. I filed a mental note: unusual deer behavior, no signs of injury, no signs of distress, and continued my patrol. I didn't even report it that night. I figured if something was really wrong, I'd see it again. 2 nights later, I did see it again. This time, I stopped and got out of the truck. I wanted a better look. I walked to the shoulder and stood about 50 feet from the nearest group of deer. There were 7 this time, in a loose cluster near the tree line, all facing the same direction, all perfectly still. The wind was cold that night. It was blowing down from the ridge, and I could smell the grass and the rocks and that smell mountains have after dark, clean and empty. I stood there looking at these deer, and I tried to understand what I was seeing. Were they sick? They didn't look sick. Their posture was alert. Their eyes were open. They were aware. I could see them tracking my movement, but they wouldn't break position. Were they eating? No. There was grass all around them, and they weren't lowered down to browse. They were standing upright, like they were waiting for something. Were they watching something in the distance? That was the thought that kept coming back to me. Their focus was so single-minded, so complete, that it really did look like they were watching something specific. And whatever that something was, it was up on that ridge, east of the road. I walked closer to get a better angle on their direction of sight. The nearest deer stepped back about 10 feet, the normal response, but immediately returned to the same position, still facing the same direction. I stood between them and the focus of their attention and looked at what they were looking at. Nothing. Just the dark slope of the ridge, the outline of trees against the star-filled sky, the wind moving through the branches. No movement, no lights, nothing unusual that I could see or hear. I went back to my truck and drove on. This happened 2 more times over the next week. Each time, the deer were there. Each time, they were facing the same direction. Each time, I couldn't identify any reason why. That's when I decided to reach out to Dr. Janelle Odom. Janelle is a wildlife ecologist from NC State. She has funding for a long-term study on black bear movement patterns in the Appalachian region. She's been working sections of the parkway for about 5 years, and I've crossed paths with her at ranger meetings and in the field. She's the kind of scientist who doesn't believe anything until she's seen it 3 times and checked her data twice. I respect that about her. I called her and said I was seeing some unusual deer behavior near Craggy Gardens, and I asked if she'd be interested in documenting it with me. She said yes, but she wanted to know what I was seeing first. So I drove back to the spot where I'd been finding the deer and called her. We stood on the shoulder together around midnight, and 10 minutes later, 3 more deer appeared from the brush and lined up, all facing east. Janelle looked at them for a long moment. Then she said, "That's not normal behavior." "No, it's not," I said. "Have you seen them do anything else? Eat? Move around?" "Just stand there, facing that direction." Janelle pulled out her phone and took some photos. Then she said, "I've got something to show you. Not here. At my field office." 2 days later, I drove to the small research station Janelle had set up near the town of Blowing Rock. It's a converted cabin with a lot of computer equipment, trail camera data, and GPS collar information spread across tables and whiteboards. Janelle told me she'd been tracking 8 black bears in the Craggy Gardens area using GPS collars. 3 of those bears were in the area where I'd been seeing the unusual deer behavior, and she'd noticed something strange in their movement data. "Look at this," she said, pulling up a map on her computer. The map showed GPS points plotted over time. For each bear, the points traced a kind of path where the bear had been, hour by hour. Mostly, the points were scattered randomly across the landscape, which is what you'd expect from a free-roaming bear. But there were gaps. "These are the last 3 weeks," Janelle said. "Every night, between 9:47 p.m. and 4:12 a.m., all 3 bears stop moving. Complete cessation of movement. The GPS shows them stationary for over 6 hours each night." I looked at the data. She was right. Every night, without exception, the same time window. 9:47 p.m., 4:12 a.m. Completely still. "What does that mean?" I asked. "I don't know," Janelle said. "Bears are most active at night. They should be moving, foraging, doing bear things. They shouldn't be sitting still for 6 hours. That's not normal behavior for black bears. Not in October, and when they're supposed to be in hyperphagia, basically eating constantly to prepare for hibernation." I studied the data. The precision of the times was strange. Not approximately 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. Exactly 9:47 to 4:12. "Has this been happening the whole time you've had the collars on them?" I asked. "The entire 3 weeks," Janelle said. "Every single night." I suggested we set up trail cameras across the area where I'd been seeing the deer. Janelle was interested, but she wanted to approach it scientifically. We decided to set up a grid of 20 cameras across the watershed surrounding Craggy Gardens. Different elevations, different habitats, ridge tops, mid-slope, creek bottom, forest edges. We'd let them run for a full week and review the footage together. Janelle set up most of the cameras with my help. We hiked different trails. We checked elevation and sight lines. We made sure we had good coverage of the area. It took us most of a day, but we got all 20 cameras positioned and running. A week later, we met back at her field office to review the footage. Janelle had a system set up on her computer that could run through the video quickly, speeding it up so that an entire night of footage could be reviewed in maybe 5 minutes. She started with the camera footage from the first night. The footage from the camera that covered the high ridge area showed typical wildlife activity for the first few hours. A deer passed through the frame around 8 p.m. A raccoon foraged in the brush around 9 p.m. An owl sat in a tree. All normal, random behavior. Then the timestamp hit 9:47 p.m., and everything stopped. The deer, which had been moving through the frame, froze mid-step. The raccoon, which had been digging in the dirt, went completely motionless. The owl, which had been preening, held perfectly still, and over the next few seconds, more animals entered the frame. More deer, a fox, and every single one of them oriented their body toward one specific direction. The same direction the deer on the road had been facing. They stayed like that, unmoving, for the next 6 hours and 25 minutes. At 4:12 a.m. exactly, the animals came back to life. The deer started walking again. The raccoon resumed foraging. The owl shifted on its branch. Janelle didn't say anything. She just moved on to the next camera. The footage from the creek bottom camera showed the same thing. At 9:47, a family of opossums that had been moving through the frame froze and oriented themselves toward the same direction. Several mice scurried into frame, stopped, and aligned themselves the same way. The next camera, the same thing. Coyotes, foxes, more deer. Every camera, every night. Every single animal showing the exact same behavior. Stopped at 9:47 p.m., facing the same direction. Motionless until 4:12 a.m., then resuming normal behavior. Janelle ran through all 7 nights of footage in about an hour. The pattern was absolutely consistent. No variations, no exceptions. Every animal in every camera feed did the exact same thing. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair and didn't speak for a long time. "What am I looking at?" I finally asked. "I don't know," Janelle said quietly. She opened a map program and pulled up the GPS coordinates from each camera. Then she drew lines on the map, lines from each camera showing the direction the animals had been facing. Every single line converged on one point, a location on the ridge at approximately 5,800 feet elevation, about 200 yards off the parkway, between 2 of the tunnel openings. "That's the focal point," Janelle said. "Whatever they're looking at, it's at those coordinates." I hiked to those coordinates the next day, alone. It was mid-afternoon, bright and clear. The kind of day that makes the Blue Ridge feel like the safest place on Earth. I parked my truck at one of the tunnel overlooks and found the trail that led up the ridge. The hike took me about 40 minutes, climbing through dense rhododendrons and over rocky outcrops. I used my GPS to navigate to the precise coordinates Janelle had mapped. When I got there, I was looking at a patch of grass. Literally. A flat area of grass about 10 feet across, surrounded by rocks and low brush. No cave, no spring, no unusual features of any kind, just grass and rock and the Blue Ridge stretching out below. I stood on the exact GPS coordinates and looked around. There was nothing. No marks in the grass, no disturbed soil, no dead animals. No bones or blood or any sign of anything unusual. I took soil samples. I took air temperature readings. I recorded the GPS coordinates again to confirm I was in the right spot. Everything was normal. The soil was normal. The temperature was normal. The air smelled normal. Then I stood there and looked at what was around me. The trees, the sky, the landscape. Trying to understand why every animal within 6 miles was focused on this exact spot at night. I couldn't come up with an answer. I came back to the same spot, alone, at 9:40 p.m. I parked my truck a quarter mile away and hiked in using a red flashlight, which doesn't spook animals as much as white light. The night was clear, cold. The wind was blowing down from higher elevation, and there was that smell again, clean, empty, ancient. I reached the coordinates and stood on the same patch of grass I'd stood on during the day. I waited. At 9:47 p.m., I didn't feel anything. No sound. No change in air pressure. No sensation of any kind. But the forest around me went absolutely silent. I don't mean it got quiet. I mean it went completely, utterly silent. No crickets. No wind in the branches. No rustling of small animals. No ambient forest sound at all. Just the sound of my own breathing. Then I turned on my spotlight. The first thing I noticed was that the beam seemed shorter than it should be, like the light was being absorbed by something. But that didn't make sense. There was nothing in front of me. I swept the light across the tree line. Eyes. Hundreds of them. Green glowing eyes reflecting my light back at me from every direction. Some low to the ground. Mice, rabbits, small animals. Some at eye level. Deer, coyotes. Some up in the branches. Owls, raccoons. All of them stationary. All of them facing me. I was standing at the center of a circle of watching animals. Every single one of them had their eyes on the spot where I was standing. I turned the light around, pointing away from them so they'd stop reflecting. But the moment the beam moved, I could hear them shifting position, repositioning, turning to keep me in view. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes. I couldn't move. Not because I was paralyzed or anything like that. I could have moved if I'd wanted to. I just couldn't make myself do it. I was too aware of being watched, of being studied. Then I turned off the light. I walked back down the ridge to my truck, and I drove to the ranger station. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk and made notes about what I'd seen, or what I thought I'd seen. The green eyes could have been a trick of the light. The silence could have been psychological. My brain playing tricks on me, because I was alone in the dark. The sensation of being watched could have been anxiety about being in an unusual situation. But I knew what I'd experienced. The next morning, I told Janelle what had happened. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "We need better equipment. We need to see what's actually happening there." Janelle brought in more sophisticated monitoring equipment. She set up an infrared camera at the focal point, a camera that could detect heat signatures and film in complete darkness. She positioned it to face the area where Kyle had been standing. She ran it for 3 consecutive nights. When we reviewed the footage in her office, neither of us said anything for a long time. On the 3rd night, at 9:47 p.m. exactly, the infrared camera captured something. At the coordinates where I had stood, where nothing had been visible to the human eye, the camera showed a heat signature, something warm, roughly 8 feet tall, narrow, vertical. It appeared at 9:47. It remained motionless until 4:12 a.m. Then it disappeared. The signature was approximately 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Body temperature. Janelle slowed the footage down to individual frames and zoomed in on the heat signature. The shape wasn't featureless. There was structure. Temperature variations within the shape formed what looked like, and Janelle said this very slowly and carefully, what looked like a face. Not a human face, not an animal face. A face with features that suggested eyes, a mouth, a symmetry that registered as a face, but with proportions that were wrong, angles that didn't match anything I'd ever seen. It was there for one frame. Then it shifted. Then another frame showed a different arrangement, like it was trying different shapes. "What is it?" I asked. Janelle didn't answer right away. She rewound the footage and played it again. Watched it several more times. Finally, she said, "I think the animals can see it. I think they've always been able to see it, and I think it's been standing there every night for a very long time, and we just couldn't see it. But it could always see us." I sat back in my chair. "That's not possible," I said. "I know," Janelle said. "That's not a real explanation." I know," Janelle said again. "But that's what the data shows." I filed my report with the full data set. Trail camera footage, GPS collar data from Janelle's bears showing the behavioral patterns. The infrared captures, the precise timing, everything. My supervisor read the report. He was a good man, careful, thoughtful, someone I trusted. When he finished reading, he set the papers on his desk and was quiet for a long time. "Kyle," he said finally, "I'm going to ask you to let me handle this one." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means I'm going to make sure the right people see this. And I'm going to ask you to not talk about it outside this office until I tell you otherwise." I agreed. He was a good man, and I trusted him. 2 weeks later, the trail cameras disappeared. A team I didn't recognize collected them. They had identification and everything looked official, but I didn't recognize the agency they represented. Janelle's GPS collar data from the Craggy Bears was flagged as corrupted in the system and removed from her database. The data she'd been collecting for months was just gone. My report was reclassified from a wildlife management concern to an environmental monitoring referral, a category that, as far as I can tell, doesn't actually lead anywhere or require any follow-up action. I never heard anything about it after that. No one from any agency ever contacted me. No one interviewed Janelle. It was like it never happened, except for the fact that all the evidence had been removed and filed away somewhere. I don't choose to have access to. But the animals still do it, every night. I'm still on the parkway, still driving the night shift, still passing through that stretch near Craggy Gardens between 9:47 p.m. and 4:12 a.m. I don't stop to watch anymore, but sometimes, driving through that section in the dark, I glance in my rearview mirror, and I see the eyes, hundreds of them, all green, all still, all watching the same invisible point on the ridge. And the circle is still growing. Hank Lunsford told me that it was a 1/4 mile wide when he first noticed it 26 years ago. Now it's about 6 miles. Janelle did the math before her data got pulled. At the rate of expansion, it will reach the town of Asheville in about 12 years. A month ago, I got an email from a wildlife biologist I'd never met. He works at a national park about 400 miles away in the Appalachian region. The subject line said, "Unusual nocturnal animal behavior. Have you seen this?" I opened it. He described the exact same phenomenon. Animals freezing at night, all facing one direction. Infrared showing a heat signature. 8 feet tall. Body temperature. Except in his park. It started 6 months ago. And the focal point is different. It's on a different ridge, in a different state. I mapped both points on a geological survey map. They're on the same formation, the Blue Ridge fault line. I drew a line between them. The line points northeast, toward more mountains, more parks, more animals. I never replied to the biologist's email. I don't know what I would say. I just know that whatever is standing on that ridge at night, watching animals watch it, is not limited to one location. And it's not new. It's been there for at least 26 years in one place, and probably much longer. Long enough that the animals have learned to attend to it every single night. Long enough that something invisible to human eyes has learned to be patient, and the circle keeps growing. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it wants. I don't know if it's a threat or just something that exists. Something ancient. Something that's been on those ridges long before the parkway was built, long before anyone was paying attention. But I know that if you drive the Blue Ridge Parkway at night and you see deer standing motionless on the shoulder, all facing the same direction, you should keep driving. Don't stop. Don't get out. Don't turn on your spotlight. Because if you stand at the focal point, if you stand where it is, the animals will watch you the same way it watches them. And you'll understand that you're not observing something natural. You're being observed by something that has been invisible to humans for longer than we've had names for mountains. That's what I know. That's what I've seen. And I'll be driving that road for as long as they'll let me. Because maybe if I pay attention, really pay attention, I'll understand what it is and why it's there. But most nights, I just drive through as fast as I can between 9:47 and 4:12. I found something in the Bald River drainage that I still can't explain, and I've been a ranger in these mountains for 22 years. I'm not the type of person to make a big deal out of things. I don't get spooked easy. I've worked search and rescue on bodies that had been dead for weeks. I've tracked bears that followed hikers into campsites. I've spent more nights alone in the woods than I have in my own bed. So when I say something was wrong out there, I mean it was wrong in a way that didn't fit into any experience I'd ever had. I need to be clear about what I found before I try to explain it, because the explanation doesn't make sense without the facts. And the facts are simple. There's a stone building in the Cherokee National Forest that isn't on any map. The building was built using a construction method that predates European settlement. The water flowing through it runs uphill, and someone, or something, has been maintaining it for at least several years, maybe much longer. That's where it starts. I was out doing a spring trail survey. That's standard work. You get out after winter, check for damage, trees down across trails, erosion on creek crossings, that kind of thing. It was late March, early morning cold but warm by noon. The kind of day where you can see the sky through the bare hardwoods, but the rhododendrons are just starting to green. The Bald River drainage is in the Unaka Mountain section near the North Carolina border. Steep country, dense forest, the kind of place where you can walk 3 miles and feel like you haven't made any progress because the terrain is so broken up. I wasn't on a marked trail that day. I was off trail in a system of hollows and ridges, following an old logging roadbed that shows up on 1930s maps but doesn't exist anymore on paper. In real life, if you know what to look for, you can still see it. Certain grades to the land, subtle changes in how the trees grow, the way the rhododendron follows the old cut. The Forest Service wants to know if any of these old roads are becoming erosion problems or if the water damage is manageable. Most of them are fine. They're just getting reclaimed. In 50 more years, nobody will know they were ever there. I was crossing Bald River Creek, heading deeper into the drainage when I first saw it. The building was maybe 30 feet up the far bank, set back into the trees. Gray stone. Small. I'd guess 8 feet by 10 feet, maybe less. No roof, or what was left was just flat stones laid across that had mostly caved in. My first thought was that it was another settler structure. There are foundations and old chimneys scattered all through this forest. Before the government bought the land for the National Forest, families lived back here. They logged. They farmed the gaps. Then they sold out or their land got seized for back taxes, and the forest bought it all up and the families moved away. The mountains reclaimed it. I've found dozens of these old structures. Usually they're just piles of rock with trees growing through them, so old and collapsed that you can barely tell they were buildings. This one was different. The stonework was clean. The rocks were shaped and fitted together without any mortar, fitted tight like puzzle pieces. That's not normal settler construction. You see a lot of rough fieldstone piling at these old homesteads. Just stack the rocks and move on. But this was skilled work. Somebody had spent time on it, shaped each stone, made sure the edges fit. It was still standing solid after however many years. I crossed the creek and climbed up to it. The inside was stranger than the outside. The floor wasn't built. It was natural bedrock, and somebody had carved a channel into it. A channel maybe 6 inches wide and 4 inches deep, running from the opening at the front, straight back to the back wall. In that channel was water. Flowing water. That part would have been normal except for one thing. The water was flowing uphill. I'm serious. The creek was downhill from the building. The building sat on a slope. Water flows downhill. This water was flowing from the front of the building, from the direction of the creek, up the slope, through the channel, toward the back wall. I knelt down and put my hand in it. Cold. Regular creek water. But it was definitely flowing against gravity, against the slope of the land. At the back wall of the building, the channel opened into a hole. A round opening, about the size of a basketball, going straight back into the hillside. The water flowed into that hole and disappeared. And when I leaned close to the hole, I felt warm air coming out. Steady warm air. Like something was breathing. I remember standing there for a good 5 minutes, just staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was looking at, trying to come up with an explanation. Some kind of geological thing, some kind of spring system that I didn't understand. I'd worked in these mountains long enough to know that you can still find things that don't make sense. Systems and formations that aren't explained in any manual. But this felt different. This felt made. Someone had built this. Someone had carved that channel. And someone had done it in a way that didn't follow any law of physics that I understood. I marked the GPS location in my handheld unit and hiked back out. I didn't stay long at the site. I didn't feel scared exactly. I didn't have time to be scared. I just had a pulling sensation that I needed to leave. Not panic, just urgency. So I left. Back at the ranger station, I pulled every map I had. Current Forest Service maps, historical maps from the 1930s, old USCA's topographic sheets from every decade they'd made. I checked our cultural resource inventory. That's the database of every known historical structure in the forest. I even drove to the library in town and looked at the property records from when the Forest Service acquired the land back, in the 1930s. Nothing. The building wasn't on any of them. I kept thinking about that water. The next day I went back out with a level. A simple bubble level from my toolkit. I set it on the channel floor, right in the water, and held it steady. The bubble confirmed it. The channel sloped upward from front to back. The floor was tilted maybe 2 or 3 degrees. The water was definitely, unambiguously, flowing uphill. I called the state archaeology office and talked to someone named Nora Bunch. She's a specialist in pre-contact structures in the southern Appalachians. I explained what I'd found, and she was interested enough to come out the next week. Nora was about my age, maybe a bit younger, 36 or so. She had that way that archaeologists have of looking at something and then immediately knowing it's significant. She spent most of the day photographing the building and taking measurements. She scrubbed away moss to see the stone fitting more clearly. She took samples. And as she worked, I could see her face changing. At first, she was professional and focused. Then she got confused. Then she got serious. When she was done, she sat down outside the building and told me what she thought. "This isn't settler construction," she said. "The stone technique, the way the rocks are shaped and fitted, this is something else. I've only seen this method a couple of other times, in a few structures scattered through the southern Appalachians. Most of them aren't documented. They're just in the mountains. And nobody really knows who built them or when." I asked her if the Cherokee built it. "I don't think so," she said. "The Cherokee have their own building traditions, and this isn't it. But here's the thing. The Cherokee oral histories talk about finding structures like this already in place when they moved into the region. Some archaeologists think these buildings were made by ancestors of the Cherokee people, but there's no clear connection. The techniques don't match anything in the Cherokee archaeological record. It's one of the mysteries of Appalachian prehistory." I asked her how old it was. She looked at the lichen growth on the stones and gave me a rough estimate. At least 300 years based on the lichen. Possibly much longer. The lichens in this region grow slowly. To have the coverage I'm seeing, with the density and color variation, you're probably looking at several centuries minimum. She stood up and looked at the building again, then at the hole in the back wall. The channel design is interesting, she said. Spring houses are pretty common in this region. Settlers would build them over natural springs to keep the water cold and protected. But in a normal spring house, the water flows out, away from the spring. You direct the cold water toward your house or your farm. This one is backwards. If water really is flowing into the hill, then something built this intentionally. Someone designed it that way on purpose. I didn't mention the breathing. I went back a third time about a week later. I was looking for any signs of who had been maintaining the building. That was when I noticed something I'd missed before. The inside was clean, not just empty, clean. There were no leaves inside, even though the forest floor around it was covered in years of dead leaves. No debris, no spider webs, even though this time of year those are everywhere in the forest. The floor was swept bare, and the stones of the walls, they had no moss on them, even though every other rock in the area was covered in a thick, fuzzy layer. Someone was keeping this place maintained. I did a wider search around the building, looking for footprints or any sign of human activity. The ground was rocky, so footprints were hard to see, but on a tree about 50 yards away, I found something. A strip of cloth tied to a branch. Old cloth, faded, but not rotten. Below it, another strip on a lower branch, and below that, a small stack of creek stones. 3 stones stacked on top of each other. Trail markers. Old-style trail markers, the kind people used to make before blazes and signs. Someone had been coming here using a marked route. The cloth was faded enough that it had been there for years. Maybe 2, maybe 5. But it hadn't rotted completely. So it hadn't been there for decades. Whatever was happening at this building, it was recent. It was ongoing. That night, I drove to the farmhouse on Tellico River Road where Ellis Bowman lives. Ellis is 82 years old. His family was in Bald River Gorge before the government bought it. His grandfather had actually homesteaded there. Ellis doesn't get out much anymore. He sits on his porch in the afternoons, even in cold weather, and watches the road. He was sitting there when I drove up, in a flannel coat, drinking coffee. I asked him if he knew anything about an old stone building in the Bald River drainage. He set his coffee cup down and looked at me for a moment before he answered. "You found the spring house," he said. I told him about the water, about how it flowed uphill. "That's why they call it a spring house," Ellis said. "Not because it has a spring in the normal way. Because it is the spring. The water goes in, something uses it, and what comes out on the other end, a long way from where it goes in, is what feeds the creek." I asked him where he heard that. "My daddy told me," Ellis said. His daddy told him. Goes back generations. The old people knew about it. The Cherokee knew about it. Told my daddy's daddy that the spring house was there before the Cherokee ever moved into these mountains. They said something built it. Something old. Old enough that even the mountains remembered it. "What is it?" I asked. Ellis looked away, toward the forest beyond the edge of his property. "My daddy called it the Drinker," he said. Said that's what the Cherokee called it. Said it was under the mountain. Said it drank the water and the water came out changed. Colder, cleaner, full of something that made things grow. Said every creek and branch that runs off that mountain starts from whatever comes out the other end of that spring house, far down in the rock where people can't see." He picked his coffee back up. I asked if anyone had ever looked inside the hole, if anyone had ever tried to see what was back there. Ellis was quiet for a long time. "My granddaddy looked in once," he said finally. "Went out there with a lantern, a long time ago. He said he could see the channel keep going back, straight into the rock, further than his light would reach. He said the walls were smooth like they'd been finished. He said there were marks on them." "What kind of marks?" I asked. Ellis didn't answer that. He just took a sip of his coffee and stared out at the forest. "He came home from that trip and he drank a bottle of whiskey," Ellis said. "And he didn't go back to the Bald River drainage for 3 years after that. When he did go back, he said the building was cleaner than it had ever been. He said somebody had been taking care of it. I went back to the spring house one more time. About 5 days after talking to Ellis, I went in the late afternoon, knowing I'd have some daylight and some dark, and I wanted to see what changed when the light went away. I sat about 50 feet from the building with my back against a rock. The water was still flowing uphill, steady and constant. The warm air was still coming out of the hole, but as the sun went down and the air temperature dropped, I could see the warm air more clearly. It was visible now, rising out of the hole like breath from a mouth on a cold day, steam. And it wasn't random, it was rhythmic, breath, puff, pause, puff, pause. Like something breathing, like something sleeping or resting, taking slow, long breaths. At full dark, I heard a sound from inside the building. Not from the hole in the back wall, from the water channel itself. A low sound, resonant, like water running through a pipe, but musical. Almost like humming. A single note that sustained and then rose and fell slightly. The way a person hums to themselves without thinking. Comfortable, familiar. And then the water stopped. Just stopped. No flow, no movement. The channel went perfectly still. The water just sat there, motionless, in the carved stone, for about 15 seconds. Then it started again, and when it started, it was flowing faster. Like whatever was on the other end of that hole had been holding its breath, and just let it out. I didn't stay much longer after that. I hiked back to my truck in the dark, and I drove home to my wife Karen. She was waiting with dinner, a pot of chili she'd made, and she asked me how the survey went. I told her fine, nothing remarkable, just the usual trail damage from winter weather. I didn't tell her about the spring house. I brought Nora back out about a week later. This time she came prepared. She had equipment with her, ground-penetrating radar, the kind of thing that can see into the earth without digging. We set up the sensors around the spring house and ran the scans. The results showed exactly what Nora thought they would, and exactly what she didn't want them to show. The channel goes back 140 feet into the rock, straight, level, and then it opens into a chamber. The radar couldn't resolve the chamber clearly. The readings were confused, returning signals that bounced back in a pattern that suggested something organic. Not rock, not stone, something else. Nora looked at the screen, and her jaw tightened. "There's a space back there," she said. "A chamber, maybe 30 feet across, hard to tell. And whatever's in it, it's not geological." She packed up the equipment, and we drove back to town in silence. That night, I camped near the spring house site. I know that sounds stupid. It probably was. But I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I set up a basic camp about 100 yards away, upslope from the building, with a clear view of the opening. At 2 in the morning, I woke up to sound. The humming was back, but louder, and with it, a new sound. Water. A lot of water. Not flowing. Gushing. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the building. The channel was overflowing. Water was pouring out of the front opening of the building. The water that had been flowing in was now flowing out, and it was warm. Steam was rising off it in the cold night air. I could see the vapor, white and thick, hanging over the building. I pointed my flashlight at the hole in the back wall. The warm air had stopped coming out. Instead, warm water was flowing out of the hole, streaming out, pouring down the channel and out the building door and down the slope toward the creek. The flow was strong, powerful, like something was pushing it out from deep in the rock. The water had things in it, small objects carried by the flow, creek stones, smooth, round rocks, the same kind stacked as trail markers. They tumbled down the channel and out of the building. I caught one with my hand. It was warm, still warm from wherever it had been, and it had a mark on it, a single carved line, straight, deliberate. The water flowed like that for about 10 minutes. Hot water, carrying warm stones, pouring out of the building and down the slope. The smell was strange, not bad, just different, like something heated and alive. Then it stopped. The water stopped flowing. The steam stopped rising. For maybe a minute, there was complete silence. Even the creek sound seemed distant and muted. Then the warm air started again, steady, breathing, and the water resumed its normal flow, uphill, into the hole, back into the dark. I packed up my camp in the dark. I didn't run. I just moved efficiently, gathering my gear, and I walked back toward the main trail with my flashlight pointed at the ground. I didn't look back at the spring house. I didn't want to see anything else that night. I hiked out and drove to the ranger station, and I filed a report. The building exists. It's significant. It needs investigation. The Forest Service sent a team out. 3 archaeologists and a geologist, guys I didn't know. They spent 3 days at the site. I wasn't allowed to go with them. It was a research team, not a ranger operation. They documented everything. They took more samples. They did their own ground-penetrating radar. Then they packed up and left. When they left, the spring house was still there. They hadn't disturbed it. It looked exactly like it had when they arrived, but the following week, I hiked in to check on things. Routine, just making sure nothing had changed. The building was cleaner than I'd ever seen it. The stones were practically polished. The channel floor was clear and smooth. And outside the entrance, there was a stack of creek stones. 3 stones high, exactly like the trail markers. Except nobody had been back there since the team left. The trail markers that led to the building were still faded and weathered. There were no new footprints, no sign of human activity at all. Someone had maintained the spring house in the dark, between the time the research team left and the time I returned. Or something had. I filed another report. I said the site needed continued monitoring. The Forest Service agreed, but funding was tight, and there wasn't enough in the budget to do regular patrols. They asked me to check on it when I had time. Check for any damage. Make sure it wasn't being affected by erosion or weather. I agreed to do that. 6 weeks after the research team left, I was fishing on the Tellico River, about 11 miles downstream from the spring house. 11 miles downstream, as the crow flies, from that chamber deep in the rock. It was late afternoon. Good light. The water was running cold from snowmelt upstream. Clear, just the way I like it. I was standing on a rock in the shallows, casting into a pool where I've caught brown trout before. It was mindless work, the kind of thing I do to think. I dipped my hand in the water to check the temperature. 52 degrees. Normal. Cold. Clear. I could see the stones on the bottom of the creek, smooth and round, the way creek stones are. I stood there, and I was thirsty, so I bent down and took a drink the way I've done 100 times. The water ran cold through my mouth and down my throat. It tasted like always. Clean mountain water, iron taste to it, the taste of the mountains. But for just one moment, for less than a half second, between when I swallowed and when I breathed in again, I felt something I have never felt before or since. A connection, like the water knew me. Like it remembered the taste of my hand from weeks before, when I touched it in the carved channel of the spring house. Like it recognized me. And somewhere, 11 miles upstream and 140 feet into solid rock, something that has been drinking and breathing and humming in the dark since before the mountains had a name, took another long, slow sip. And it knew that I knew. I don't go to that drainage anymore. I file the reports. I say the site is stable. I mark it in the system as significant. But I don't go there. I don't know what's at the end of that channel. I don't know what maintains the building in the dark. I don't know why the water flows uphill, or where it comes from, or what it becomes when it comes out on the other side of the mountain. But I know it's aware of me now, and every time I drink water from the Tellico River, or any creek in that drainage, every single time, I feel it. That same moment of recognition, that same pulling sensation that something down in the dark, something old, is acknowledging that I exist. My wife Karen asked me once why I stopped fishing, why I stopped going to the Bald River drainage. I told her the terrain was getting harder as I got older, that I'd found most of what I needed to find out there, that my knees were shot and I needed to take it easy. She believed me. But the truth is simpler than that. The water is waiting for me down there. It's been changed by whatever that is. And whatever that is, it knows my taste now. I spent 22 years protecting these mountains, knowing their trails, their creeks, their hidden places, knowing that they were mine and that I was part of them. Now I'm not sure who owns what anymore, and I think about the water every single day. I think about where it's been, what it's touched in the dark, what it knows. And I never want to be thirsty enough to drink from a river I can't trace back to its source.